My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 32 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, where the rain has a way of washing away everything except the memories you wish you could forget. 3 days ago, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about my life. Sarah, honey, it's time. My grandmother's voice was barely a whisper through the hospital phone. Eleanor Mitchell had been battling cancer for 8 months, and we all knew this day would come. But knowing something and experiencing it are two completely different things. I had been working late at my graphic design studio downtown, putting the finishing touches on a logo for a local coffee roaster, when my phone buzzed on the desk beside me. The caller ID showed OHSU Hospital, and my heart immediately sank. Eleanor had been in and out of the hospital for weeks, and each call brought the possibility that this would be the last one. The drive to the hospital felt like it took forever, even though I knew every street between my apartment in the Pearl District and OHSU on Pill Hill. Portland in October is beautiful in its own melancholy way. The leaves on the maple trees turning brilliant shades of orange and red, the early evening mist rolling in from the Columbia River Gorge, the smell of wood smoke from chimneys mixing with the perpetual dampness in the air. Eleanor had always loved this time of year. She used to say that October in Portland reminded her of fresh starts and new possibilities. I never understood what she meant by that until now, driving through the city she had called home for over 60 years, knowing that this would probably be my last conversation with the woman who had been more like a second mother to me than a grandmother. I drove through the familiar streets of downtown Portland, past the coffee shops and bookstores that had shaped my childhood visits to Grandma Eleanor's house. Powell's Books on Burnside, where she had bought me my first set of Nancy Drew mysteries when I was 8. The food trucks on Alder Street, where we had shared countless lunches during my high school years when I was going through my rebellious phase and needed someone to talk to who wouldn't judge me. Eleanor had a way of listening that made you feel like your problems were the most important thing in the world, even when they were just teenage drama about boyfriends or friend groups or college applications. She never minimized what I was feeling, never told me I was being dramatic or that things would work out fine. She just listened, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. The October rain drummed against my windshield, creating patterns that reminded me of the lace curtains in her living room window. She had lived in the same Victorian house in the Hawthorne district for 47 years, ever since she married my grandfather in 1976. The house had always felt like a sanctuary to me, with its creaky wooden floors, its rooms filled with books and plants, and the smell of whatever Eleanor was baking in her ancient oven. As a child, I had spent every summer at that house while my parents worked. Eleanor would wake me up early to help her tend the garden, teaching me the names of all the flowers and showing me how to tell when the tomatoes were ready to pick. We would spend afternoons on the front porch. She would read to me from classic novels, her voice rising and falling with the drama of the story. She had introduced me to Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte, to Louisa May Alcott and Zora Neale Hurston. "Stories matter, Sarah," she would say, her fingers turning the worn pages of books she had read dozens of times. "They teach us how to be human, how to love, how to forgive. They show us that we're not alone in our struggles." I realize now that Eleanor was trying to teach me something important with all those stories, that people are complex, that everyone has a past they're carrying, that the surface of a person's life rarely tells the whole truth. But at the time, I just loved the sound of her voice and the way she could transport me to different worlds with her storytelling. When I arrived at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant hit me like a wall. I had been here so many times over the past 8 months that I knew exactly which elevator to take, which floor to go to, which nurses would be working the evening shift. The oncology ward had become as familiar to me as my own neighborhood. My mother, Janet, was already there, sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Eleanor's bed. She looked older than her 55 years, her auburn hair streaked with more gray than I remembered, her usually bright eyes red from crying. She hugged me tightly when I arrived, and I could feel her trembling. "She's been asking for you," Mom whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of talking to doctors and nurses. "She says she has something important to tell you, something she's never told anyone else." I looked at Eleanor lying in that hospital bed, and my heart broke all over again. She had always been such a vibrant presence, tall and elegant, with silver hair that she wore in a neat bun, and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and humor. Even in her 70s and early 80s, she had maintained a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood, had volunteered at the local library, had hosted elaborate holiday dinners that brought together friends and family from all over the city. But the cancer had stolen so much from her. She looked fragile now, almost translucent, as if she might disappear if I wasn't careful. Her silver hair was thin and brittle from the chemotherapy, and her hands, which had always been so strong and capable, looked like bird bones wrapped in paper-thin skin. The machines around her bed beeped and hummed like mechanical lullabies, monitoring her heart rate and oxygen levels, keeping track of the medication that was supposed to make her comfortable in these final hours. I had grown to hate those sounds. They represented everything that was wrong, everything that couldn't be fixed, everything that was slipping away from us. "Sarah, my dear girl," she said, reaching for my hand with fingers that felt like paper. Her voice was so quiet I had to lean close to hear her. "I need you to do something for me, something very important." I sat beside her bed, holding her hand gently, afraid that if I squeezed too hard, I might hurt her. "Anything, Grandma. What do you need?" Eleanor's eyes darted around the room, making sure we were alone. My mother had stepped out to talk to the nurse about pain medication, and the evening shift was changing, so the hallways were busy with staff coming and going. "I need you to go to my house," Eleanor said, her words coming slowly and deliberately, as if each one required enormous effort. "In the basement, there's an old steamer trunk behind the water heater. It's locked, but the key is taped under the third drawer of my bedroom dresser." She paused, breathing heavily, and I could see the pain flickering across her face despite the morphine drip. "I need you to take everything in that trunk and burn it. All of it. Promise me, Sarah." The urgency in her voice caught me completely off guard. In all the years I had known Eleanor, through all the conversations we had shared, I had never seen her look so desperate, so frightened. Her grip on my hand was surprisingly strong, and her green eyes were wide with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Grandma, what's in the trunk? Why do you want me to burn it?" Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were filled with a sadness so deep it made my chest ache. "Some things are better left buried," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have done it years ago, but I was too much of a coward. Promise me you'll burn it all. Don't read anything. Don't look through it. Just burn it." I wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand what could be so terrible that she would make this her final request. But looking at her face, seeing the fear and desperation there, I knew that pressing for details would only cause her more pain. "I promise, Grandma," I said, though something in my chest felt tight with unspoken questions. "I'll take care of it." Eleanor smiled then, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the woman she had been before the cancer. Strong, determined, but also deeply loving. "You're a good girl, Sarah. Always have been. You remind me so much of myself when I was your age." She squeezed my hand one more time, and I could feel some of the tension leaving her body. "Take care of your mother for me. She's going to need you in the coming weeks. And remember, no matter what you might hear or think you know about me, I love you all more than words can express." She died 6 hours later, just as the sun was setting over the Willamette River, casting long shadows across the hospital room. The doctors said it was peaceful, that she simply drifted away in her sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been holding on just long enough to make sure I would fulfill her final request. My mother and I sat with her body for a while, neither of us ready to leave. The machines had been turned off, and the room was finally quiet, except for the distant sounds of the hospital continuing its work in other rooms, other floors. I held Eleanor's hand, which was already growing cold, and tried to process the enormity of what had just happened. Eleanor Mitchell had been the cornerstone of our family for as long as I could remember. She was the one who remembered everyone's birthday, who hosted holiday dinners, who kept the family stories and traditions alive. She had been married to my grandfather Harold for 52 years until his death in 2009. She had raised my mother Janet as a single parent for several years when my grandfather was stationed overseas during the Vietnam War. She had been the steady, reliable presence that held us all together. And now she was gone, taking with her whatever secrets were locked away in that trunk in her basement. The next 2 days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and family gatherings. My mother was devastated, leaning on me for support as we planned the service and dealt with the endless paperwork that comes with death. My father, David, flew in from Seattle, where he'd been working on a construction project for the past 6 months. He was a quiet man who showed his emotions through actions rather than words, and I watched him take over all the practical details, contacting the funeral home, arranging for flowers, coordinating with the church. My younger brother, Marcus, drove down from Vancouver with his wife, Linda, and their 2 kids, Emma, who was 7, and Jake, who was 5. Marcus looked older than his 28 years, the stress of the past few months showing in the lines around his eyes and the way his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. He had been working overtime to pay for his daughter Emma's speech therapy, and the added expense of travel and time off work was clearly weighing on him. But despite the financial stress, Marcus had adored Eleanor, and his grief was raw and immediate. I found him crying in Eleanor's kitchen the morning before the funeral, holding a coffee mug she had given him for his birthday 2 years earlier. "She always made everything better," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Remember when Linda and I were having all those problems after Jake was born? When we thought we might get divorced? Eleanor just showed up at our apartment with a casserole and stayed for 3 days, helping with the kids and just listening to us fight it out. She never took sides, never gave advice unless we asked for it. She just loved us through it." I remembered that time. Marcus and Linda had been struggling with postpartum depression and financial stress, and their marriage had been hanging by a thread. Eleanor had simply packed a bag and moved in with them for a long weekend, cooking meals and doing laundry, and giving them space to remember why they had fallen in love in the first place. "She had a gift for knowing exactly what people needed," I said, putting my arm around Marcus's shoulders. "She always seemed to show up at exactly the right moment." The funeral was held at Powell Butte Methodist Church, where Eleanor had been a member for over 30 years. The sanctuary was packed with people whose lives she had touched: neighbors from the Hawthorne district, volunteers from the library and the hospital, friends from her book club and her garden club, former students from the Sunday school classes she had taught for decades. Pastor Williams spoke about her kindness, her dedication to the community, and her love for her family. He talked about how Eleanor had quietly helped so many people over the years, bringing meals to new mothers, visiting shut-ins, organizing fundraisers for families facing medical bills. She had never sought recognition for any of it. She had simply seen needs and tried to meet them. I gave a eulogy, talking about how she had taught me to bake her famous apple pie, and how she always seemed to know exactly what to say when I was going through a difficult time. I told the story about how she had driven to my college dorm at 2 a.m. during my sophomore year when I had called her crying about a breakup, and how she had brought homemade chocolate chip cookies and had sat with me until dawn, listening to me pour out my heart. Eleanor Mitchell was the kind of person who made the world a better place simply by being in it, I said, looking out at the sea of faces in the congregation. She loved deeply, she listened carefully, and she never met a problem that couldn't be solved with kindness and a good meal. She taught us that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about showing up for each other, especially when things get hard. But throughout the entire service, I couldn't stop thinking about that trunk in the basement and her desperate plea to burn its contents without looking at them. What could be so important that she would make it her final request? What secrets had Eleanor been carrying all these years? After the burial at Riverview Cemetery, everyone gathered at Eleanor's house for the traditional post-funeral meal. The living room was filled with the voices of relatives I hadn't seen in years, sharing stories and comforting each other. My Aunt Patricia, my father's sister, brought her famous tuna casserole, the same dish she brought to every family gathering. My cousin Robert helped serve coffee to the older relatives, and my second cousin Amy organized a memory table where people could share written remembrances of Eleanor. The house felt different that day, filled with people, but somehow emptier than I had ever experienced it. It was as if Eleanor's absence had changed the very atmosphere of the place. The afternoon light streaming through her lace curtains seemed dimmer, and the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old house seemed sadder somehow. I found myself watching the family interactions with new eyes, noticing things I had never paid attention to before. How my mother moved through Eleanor's kitchen with the confidence of someone who had spent countless hours there. How my father automatically knew where Eleanor kept her good dishes and serving platters. How my brother Marcus unconsciously sat in the same chair he had always chosen as a child when we visited for Sunday dinners. We were all part of Eleanor's story, I realized. She had shaped us in ways both big and small, had created traditions and memories that would outlive her. But there was clearly another story, a hidden story that none of us knew anything about. As evening approached and people began to leave, I found myself standing in Eleanor's kitchen, looking out at the small garden where she had grown tomatoes and roses every summer. The October air was crisp and clear, and the last roses of the season were still blooming despite the cooler temperatures. Eleanor had always said that roses were like people. They could survive more than you'd expect if they had strong roots and someone who cared for them. "You okay, honey?" my mother asked, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. She looked exhausted, her eyes puffy from crying and her usually perfect hair disheveled from the long day. "Just thinking about Grandma," I said. "She was such a private person, wasn't she? I mean, we knew her so well in some ways, but in other ways it feels like there was so much about her we never really understood." Mom nodded slowly. "She was. Even when your father and I were first married, she kept to herself about certain things. I always figured it was just her generation, you know? They didn't share everything the way we do now. They had been through the Depression and World War II. They were used to keeping their troubles to themselves." "Did she ever talk about her family? About her childhood?" "Not much," Mom said, settling into one of Eleanor's kitchen chairs with a tired sigh. "She said her parents died when she was young, that she had been raised by an aunt. She never seemed to want to talk about it, so we never pressed her. Harold used to say that some people's pasts were too painful to revisit." I thought about this as I helped my mother clean up the dishes and put away the leftover food. Eleanor had always been vague about her early life, changing the subject whenever anyone asked too many questions about her childhood or her family. I had always assumed, like my mother, that it was because those memories were too painful to share. But now I wondered if there was something else, something that had made her so desperate to keep her secrets buried that she would make burning them her final request. That night, I stayed at Eleanor's house to begin the process of sorting through her belongings. My mother had asked me to take the lead on this since I had always been closest to Eleanor and had spent so many summers helping her organize her attic and basement. Lying in Eleanor's guest bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the old house settling around me. The floorboards creaked and the wind rattled the windows in their frames. I thought about all the stories Eleanor had told me over the years, about growing up during the Great Depression, about meeting my grandfather at a dance hall in downtown Portland, about the early years of their marriage. But now I realized there were gaps in those stories, spaces where other memories should have been. She had never talked much about the time before she met my grandfather or about her family. I had always assumed it was because those memories were too painful, but now I wondered if there was something else. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would find that trunk and see what Eleanor had been so desperate to hide. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of rain pattering against the bedroom window. The Portland sky was its usual October gray, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the city like a wet blanket. I made coffee in Eleanor's old percolator, the same one she had used every morning for as long as I could remember. Sitting at her kitchen table, I called my office to let them know I would be taking the rest of the week off. I work as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm downtown, and my boss, Jennifer, was understanding about the situation. "Take all the time you need, Sarah," she said. "Family comes first." After breakfast, I began the task of going through Eleanor's personal belongings. I started with her bedroom, carefully folding clothes and separating items to donate from those that held sentimental value. In her jewelry box, I found the pearl necklace she had worn to my college graduation and the gold watch that had belonged to my grandfather. The dresser was an old oak piece that Eleanor had refinished herself in the 1980s. The drawers were full of scarves, handkerchiefs, and the kinds of small personal items that accumulate over a lifetime. When I reached the third drawer, I ran my fingers along the underside, feeling for the key Eleanor had mentioned. There it was, taped exactly where she had said it would be. A small brass key, tarnished with age. I held it in my palm, feeling its weight, and wondered again what Eleanor had been so afraid of. The basement stairs creaked as I made my way down, carrying a flashlight even though the overhead bulb still worked. The basement smelled of dust and old wood, with a hint of the lavender sachets Eleanor used to keep in her storage boxes. I had been down here many times over the years, helping her retrieve Christmas decorations or looking for old photo albums. The water heater hummed quietly in the corner, and behind it, just as Eleanor had described, was an old steamer trunk. It was made of leather and wood, with brass corners and a heavy brass lock. The trunk looked like it had traveled many miles, with scratches and scuff marks that spoke of a history I knew nothing about. I inserted the key and turned it slowly. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo in the small basement space. I lifted the heavy lid, and the hinges groaned in protest. Inside the trunk, I found layers of documents, photographs, and letters, all carefully wrapped in tissue paper or stored in manila envelopes. The smell of old paper and faded ink rose from the trunk like a ghost from the past. I picked up the first item, a manila envelope marked "Personal" in Eleanor's careful handwriting. Inside were photographs I had never seen before. Eleanor as a young woman, but not the young woman I knew from the family albums upstairs. In these pictures, she looked different somehow, more guarded, with a sadness in her eyes that I had never noticed before. There were documents, too, official-looking papers with letterheads I didn't recognize, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and what appeared to be legal documents. I began to read, and as I did, I felt the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my grandmother beginning to shift. Eleanor Mitchell had not been her real name. According to the documents in the trunk, she had been born Eleanor Catherine Morrison in Chicago, Illinois in 1934. The birth certificate was signed by a doctor I'd never heard of, and the address listed was in a part of Chicago that I knew had been torn down decades ago, but it was the marriage certificate that made my hands shake. Eleanor Catherine Morrison had married someone named Thomas William Patterson in 1954, 3 years before she had supposedly met my grandfather, Harold Mitchell, in Portland. I sat back on my heels, trying to process what I was reading. Eleanor had been married before, but she had always told us that Harold was her first and only love, that they had met at a dance hall and married after a whirlwind romance. I continued searching through the trunk, finding more documents that painted a picture of a life Eleanor had never shared with any of us. There were letters addressed to Eleanor Patterson, medical records, and what appeared to be legal documents related to a divorce. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a piece of blue silk, I found a small leather journal. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and the pages were filled with Eleanor's handwriting, but younger, more hurried than the careful script I knew. I opened the journal to a random page and began to read. March 15th, 1956. Thomas came home drunk again last night. I tried to stay quiet, but he found me anyway. The bruise on my arm is getting worse, and I can't hide it much longer. Mrs. Henderson next door has been asking questions. I'm scared she'll call the police, and then everything will be worse. My breath caught in my throat. The entries continued, each one painting a picture of a marriage that had been nothing like the fairy tale Eleanor had always described when talking about love and relationships. April 2nd, 1956. I've been saving money from the grocery budget, just a few dollars here and there, but it's adding up. I've hidden it in the coffee can behind the flour in the pantry. If I can save enough, maybe I can get away from here. Maybe I can start over somewhere else. I flipped through more pages, reading about Eleanor's desperate attempts to plan an escape from what was clearly an abusive marriage. The entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks apart, as if she had only been able to write when she was sure Thomas wouldn't find the journal. June 18th, 1956. I did it. I left. I took the money I had saved and bought a bus ticket to Portland. I don't know anyone there, but it's far enough away that Thomas won't find me. I'm scared, but I'm also more hopeful than I've been in 2 years. I'm going to change my name, start over completely. Eleanor Patterson is dead. I'm going to be someone new. The journal entries stopped there, but I understood now why Eleanor had been so secretive about her past. She had been running from something or someone and had built an entirely new life in Portland. When she met my grandfather Harold, she had already been living under a new identity for over a year. I sat in the dusty basement, surrounded by the pieces of Eleanor's secret life, and felt a mixture of sadness and admiration. She had been so much braver than I had ever imagined, escaping from a terrible situation and building a new life from nothing. But even as I admired her courage, I felt a deep sadness for the pain she had carried alone for so many years. She had never told anyone about Thomas Patterson, never shared the fear and trauma that had driven her to flee Chicago. She had kept that burden to herself for over 60 years. I was about to close the journal when I noticed something odd. The last few pages had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges. I ran my fingers along the binding, wondering what Eleanor had felt necessary to remove even from her private journal. As I started to pack everything back into the trunk, Preparing to fulfill Eleanor's final request, I noticed something strange. The trunk's lining was loose in one corner, and as I pressed it back into place, I felt something crinkle beneath the fabric. I worked my fingers under the lining and felt what seemed to be an envelope. Carefully, I pulled it free from where it had been hidden, probably for decades. The envelope was yellowed with age and addressed to Eleanor Patterson at an address in Portland I didn't recognize. The return address was from someone named Margaret Morrison in Chicago. The postmark was dated August 15, 1962. I stared at the envelope, knowing I should honor Eleanor's request and burn it along with everything else. But something about finding it hidden separately, apart from all the other documents, made me hesitate. Morrison was Eleanor's maiden name. Margaret Morrison could be a relative, maybe a sister Eleanor had never mentioned. The letter was postmarked 6 years after Eleanor had fled Chicago, 5 years after she had married my grandfather and started her new life. I held the envelope in my hands, feeling the weight of the decision. Eleanor had specifically asked me to burn everything without reading it, but she hadn't known about this letter hidden in the lining. She had probably forgotten it was there, or maybe she had hidden it so well that even she couldn't find it later. The rain continued to fall outside, and I could hear the sound of water dripping from the gutters. I thought about Eleanor's final words, her desperate plea to burn everything without looking at it. But I also thought about the gaps in her stories, the questions that had always lingered about her past. I made a decision that would change everything. I carefully opened the envelope and began to read. The letter was written in a shaky handwriting that spoke of age or illness, and the ink had faded to a pale blue that was barely visible on the yellowed paper. I moved closer to the basement light to read it clearly. Dear Eleanor, I hope this letter finds you well and happy in your new life. I've been trying to find you for 6 years, ever since you disappeared from Chicago. I hired a private investigator and he finally tracked you down to Portland. I know you probably don't want to hear from anyone from your old life, but I had to write to you. I'm dying, Eleanor. The doctors say I have maybe 3 months left. Before I go, I need you to know the truth about what happened after you left Chicago. I need you to know about Thomas. He didn't take your leaving well. He drank more than ever, and he became violent with anyone who crossed his path. He lost his job at the factory, and he started getting into fights at the bars downtown. But what you need to know is what happened 6 months after you left. Thomas was killed in a car accident on the south side. He was drunk, driving too fast, and he hit a tree on Lakeshore Drive. The police said he died instantly. Eleanor, you've been free for over 5 years now. You don't have to hide anymore. But there's something else, something I should have told you a long time ago. I'm not just writing to tell you about Thomas. I'm writing because I'm your sister. I know this must come as a shock. Mother and father made me promise never to tell you, but I can't take this secret to my grave. When you were 3 years old, you got very sick with scarlet fever. The doctors didn't think you would survive, and Mother had a nervous breakdown. Father decided to send you to live with his sister Mary in Chicago, thinking the change of air might help you recover. You did recover, but by then, Mary had grown so attached to you that she couldn't bear to give you back. She and her husband Frank had been trying to have children for years, and they saw you as a miracle. Father was struggling with Mother's illness and the farm, and he made the hardest decision of his life. He let Mary and Frank adopt you legally. Mary Morrison became your mother, and you became Eleanor Morrison. You were too young to remember us, your original family. Mary and Frank loved you deeply, and they gave you a good life in Chicago. Father made them promise never to tell you about your real parents, thinking it would be too confusing and painful. But I never forgot about you, Eleanor. I was 8 years old when you left, and I mourned my little sister for years. I've kept track of you as much as I could, through letters with Mary and Frank, and later through the private investigator. I know about Thomas and what he did to you. Mary wrote to me about it, about how worried she was about your marriage. She died in 1958, 2 years after you left Chicago, and she went to her grave regretting that she hadn't done more to protect you. Eleanor, you have a family here in Nebraska. You have 3 brothers and 2 sisters, and more nieces and nephews than you can count. We've never stopped thinking about you, never stopped hoping that someday you might want to know about us. I understand if you don't want to respond to this letter. I understand if you prefer to keep your new life separate from your old one. But I had to try to reach you one more time before I die. I had to let you know that you are loved, that you have always been loved, and that you have a family who would welcome you with open arms. If you ever want to know more about your real parents, or about us, I've included our family address at the bottom of this letter. Our father died in 1960, but our mother is still alive. She's 81 now, and she still talks about her little Eleanor, who got sick and went away. I hope your new life in Portland is everything you dreamed it would be. I hope you found love and happiness and peace. You deserve all of that and more. With all my love, your sister Margaret P.S. I've enclosed a photograph of all of us taken at Christmas in 1959. You're not in it, of course, but I thought you might like to see the family you came from. I stared at the letter, reading it twice more to make sure I had understood correctly. Eleanor had been adopted. She had a whole family in Nebraska that she had never known about. She had brothers and sisters who had never stopped thinking about her. I looked in the envelope again and found the photograph Margaret had mentioned. It showed a large family gathered around a Christmas tree, with an older woman in the center who had Eleanor's green eyes and silver hair. There were several men and women of various ages and a handful of children playing at their feet. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in pencil, "Morrison Family Christmas 1959, left to right. Margaret, James, Robert, Mother, Samuel, Dorothy, and their families." I studied the faces in the photograph, looking for resemblances to Eleanor. The older woman in the center had the same delicate bone structure and the same way of holding her head slightly tilted to one side. One of the men had Eleanor's nose, and one of the women had her smile. These were Eleanor's brothers and sisters, and she had never known they existed. I sat in the basement for a long time, holding the letter and the photograph, trying to process what I had learned. Eleanor had built her new life in Portland on a foundation of secrets and half-truths. She had never known about her real family, never known that her abusive husband had died just months after she fled Chicago, never known that she had been loved and missed by people she couldn't even remember. But why had she hidden this letter? The envelope had been opened, so she had read it. She had known, at least by 1962, that she had a family in Nebraska. She had known that Thomas was dead, that she was free to live openly without fear. I thought about the timeline. Eleanor had married my grandfather Harold in 1957, about a year after she had arrived in Portland. By 1962, when this letter arrived, she had been married to Harold for 5 years. She had already built her new life, established her new identity as Eleanor Mitchell. Maybe by then, it had been too late to go back. Maybe she had been too afraid to disrupt the life she had worked so hard to build. Or maybe she had been protecting Harold, not wanting him to know that his wife had been living under a false identity. I found myself feeling angry at Eleanor for the first time in my life. She had had a choice in 1962. She could have reached out to her family in Nebraska, could have told Harold the truth about her past, could have stopped carrying the burden of her secrets alone. But then, I thought about the times she had lived through. In 1962, divorce was still stigmatized, and a woman fleeing an abusive marriage would have faced judgment and suspicion. Eleanor had already risked everything once to escape Thomas. Maybe she hadn't been able to bear the thought of risking her new life by revealing the truth. I looked at the photograph again, at the faces of the family Eleanor had never known. Margaret would be dead now, of course. The letter had been written in 1962, and she had said she was dying then. But what about the others? What about Eleanor's mother, who had been 81 in 1962? What about her other brothers and sisters? I did some quick math in my head. If Eleanor's mother had been 81 in 1962, she would have been born around 1881. She would almost certainly be dead now. But Eleanor's siblings would have been in their 30s and 40s in 1962. Some of them might still be alive. I thought about my own family gathering after Eleanor's funeral, about the stories we had shared, and the comfort we had found in each other's presence. Eleanor had missed out on 60 years of that kind of connection with her real family. She had died without ever knowing her brothers and sisters, without ever meeting her nieces and nephews. But maybe it wasn't too late for the rest of us. Maybe there was still time to connect with Eleanor's family, to share her story and learn about theirs. I looked at the address at the bottom of Margaret's letter. The Morrison family had lived in a small town called Broken Bow, Nebraska. I had never heard of it, but I could look it up, maybe even try to track down any surviving members of Eleanor's family. I thought about my mother, Janet, and how she would react to learning that Eleanor had been adopted, that she had a whole family we had never known about. I thought about my father and my brother, about all the stories we had shared about Eleanor's life, stories that were now revealed to be carefully constructed fiction. But I also thought about Eleanor's final request. She had asked me to burn everything in the trunk without reading it. She had been desperate to keep these secrets buried, even after death. By reading this letter, by learning about her family in Nebraska, I was violating her final wish. I stood up and walked to the basement window, looking out at the rain-soaked garden where Eleanor had spent so many hours tending her roses. The October sky was getting darker, and I could see the lights beginning to come on in the houses across the street. I had a decision to make. I could honor Eleanor's final request and burn the letter along with everything else in the trunk. I could keep her secrets and let her family in Nebraska continue to wonder what had happened to their sister Eleanor Morrison. Or I could try to find Eleanor's family, to share her story and learn about theirs. I could give them the closure they had been seeking for over 60 years and maybe find some answers for our family as well. I looked at the photograph one more time, at the faces of the people Eleanor had never known were her brothers and sisters. I thought about Margaret, who had died in 1962, still hoping that Eleanor might respond to her letter. I thought about Eleanor's mother, who had died without ever seeing her daughter again. But I also thought about the living. If any of Eleanor's siblings were still alive, they would be in their 80s or 90s now. If I was going to reach out to them, I needed to do it soon. I made my decision. I would try to find Eleanor's family in Nebraska. I spent the next several hours in Eleanor's basement, carefully photographing every document, letter, and photograph I had found in the trunk. I wanted to preserve everything before I fulfilled Eleanor's final request to burn it all. Using my smartphone, I captured clear images of Margaret's letter, the family photograph, and all the documents that told the story of Eleanor's hidden past. When I was finished, I carried everything upstairs to Eleanor's kitchen table and spread it out like pieces of a puzzle. The rain had stopped, and pale afternoon sunlight was filtering through the lace curtains, casting intricate shadows across the documents. I opened my laptop and began searching for information about Broken Bow, Nebraska. It was a small town in the central part of the state, with a population of about 3,600 people. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where families had lived for generations, where secrets were hard to keep. I found the website for the local newspaper, the Broken Bow Chief, and searched their archives for any mention of the Morrison family. The search turned up several results, including obituaries for Frank Morrison in 1978 and Mary Morrison in 1983. There was also a brief mention of Margaret Morrison's death in 1962, confirming that she had died just months after writing the letter to Eleanor. But I also found more recent entries, an obituary for James Morrison in 2018, describing him as a beloved father and grandfather who had worked for 40 years at the local grain elevator. The obituary listed several surviving family members, including children and grandchildren. I found another obituary for Dorothy Morrison Thompson, who had died in 2015. She had been described as a devoted teacher and community volunteer who had touched the lives of countless students over her 30-year career. But the most promising lead came from a 2019 article about the town's centennial celebration. The article included a photograph of the festival's organizing committee, and one of the names caught my eye: Robert Morrison, age 89, described as the town historian and longtime resident. Robert Morrison. According to Margaret's letter, Robert had been one of Eleanor's brothers. If he was still alive and still living in Broken Bow, he would be the perfect person to contact. I searched for Robert Morrison in the Broken Bow phone directory and found a listing for Robert E. Morrison on Elm Street. I stared at the phone number for a long time, wondering what I would say if I called. How do you tell someone that their sister, who they thought had disappeared 60 years ago, had actually been living in Oregon under a different name? I decided to start with something less direct. I found the email address for the Broken Bow Chief and sent a message to the editor, explaining that I was researching my family history and was looking for information about the Morrison family. I mentioned that I had found some old documents and photographs that might be of interest to surviving family members. While I waited for a response, I continued reading through Eleanor's journal entries. The pain and fear in her words were heartbreaking, but I also found glimpses of the strength and determination that had allowed her to build a new life in Portland. July 4th, 1956. It's Independence Day, and I'm spending it alone in a tiny apartment in Portland. I don't know anyone here, and I'm scared all the time, but I'm also free. For the first time in 2 years, I'm not afraid to go to sleep at night. I'm not afraid to walk to the store or talk to the neighbors. I'm still Eleanor, but I'm not Eleanor Patterson anymore. I'm going to be Eleanor Mitchell, and Eleanor Mitchell is going to be happy. I smiled through my tears as I read that entry. Eleanor had chosen the surname Mitchell almost at random, but it had become her identity for over 60 years. She had built a life of love and happiness as Eleanor Mitchell, wife of Harold, mother of Janet, grandmother of Sarah and Marcus. My phone buzzed with an email notification. The editor of the Broken Bow Chief had responded to my message, and he had copied someone else on the email, Armoriso Town of brokenbow.gov. The editor's message was brief but encouraging. Ms. Mitchell, I've forwarded your message to Robert Morrison, who is our town historian and the last surviving member of the Morrison family from that generation. He has been researching his family history for many years and would be very interested in seeing any documents or photographs you might have. Robert Morrison's message was longer and more personal. Dear Ms. Mitchell, I received your message about the Morrison family documents. I have to admit, I'm intrigued and a bit hopeful. Our family has been searching for information about my sister Eleanor for over 60 years. She disappeared from Chicago in 1956, and we never found out what happened to her. If you have any information about Eleanor Morrison, I would be eternally grateful. Please call me at your earliest convenience. I stared at the email, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Robert Morrison was still alive, still living in Broken Bow, still wondering what had happened to his sister Eleanor. He had been searching for her for 60 years, not knowing that she had been living a full and happy life just a few states away. I picked up my phone and dialed Robert Morrison's number. It rang 3 times before a slightly shaky but warm voice answered. Hello, Robert Morrison speaking. Mr. Morrison, this is Sarah Mitchell. I sent you an email about the Morrison family documents. There was a pause, and then Robert's voice became more alert. Yes, Sarah. Thank you for calling. I have to tell you, I've been hoping for a call like this for more years than I care to count. You mentioned documents about Eleanor Morrison? I took a deep breath. Mr. Morrison, I think I have some news that's going to be difficult to hear, but also wonderful in its own way. I believe Eleanor Morrison was my grandmother. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that I wondered if the connection had been lost. Mr. Morrison, are you still there? I'm here, he said quietly. I'm trying to process what you just said. Eleanor Morrison was your grandmother? But that would mean... It means she survived, Mr. Morrison. She got away from Thomas Patterson, and she started a new life in Portland, Oregon. She changed her name to Eleanor Mitchell, and she lived here for over 60 years. She died just last week. I heard Robert take a shaky breath. She's dead? Yes, sir. She passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 87 years old. 87, Robert repeated. That's right. She would have been 87 this year. Dear God, she was alive all this time. Mr. Morrison, I found a trunk in her basement with documents about her life in Chicago, including a letter from your sister Margaret, dated 1962. Margaret was trying to find Eleanor, to tell her about the family she had never known she had. Robert's voice was thick with emotion. Margaret never gave up looking for Eleanor. She died believing that Eleanor was still out there somewhere, still alive. She would have been so happy to know that she was right. I have the letter Margaret wrote, and the photograph of the family from Christmas 1959. I also have Eleanor's journal entries from when she was fleeing from Thomas Patterson. I know this is a lot to process, but would you like me to share these things with you? Yes, Robert said immediately. Yes, I would like that very much. But first, I need to know, was she happy? Did she have a good life? I thought about Eleanor's house full of laughter during family gatherings, about the way she had danced with my grandfather at their 50th wedding anniversary party, about the love and warmth she had shown to all of us over the years. She was very happy, Mr. Morrison. She married a wonderful man named Harold Mitchell, and they were together for 52 years until he died in 2009. She had a daughter, my mother Janet, and 2 grandchildren, my brother Marcus and me. She was beloved by everyone who knew her. Did she ever talk about her family in Nebraska? Did she know about us? I hesitated, thinking about the letter hidden in the trunk's lining. I think she received Margaret's letter, but she never responded to it. I believe she was afraid to disrupt the life she had built. She never told any of us about her past, about Chicago, or about having a family in Nebraska. She was protecting herself, Robert said with understanding. She had been through so much trauma. I can understand why she would want to keep that part of her life buried. Mr. Morrison, I'd like to scan all the documents and photographs and send them to you. I think it's important that you have them, that you finally know what happened to Eleanor. That would mean the world to me, Sarah. And please call me Robert. We're family after all. Over the next several days, I scanned and emailed all the documents to Robert Morrison. I also sent him photographs of Eleanor from our family albums, showing her wedding to Harold, her life in Portland, and our family gatherings over the years. Robert called me after he had received everything, and we talked for over 2 hours. He told me about Eleanor's early childhood in Nebraska, about the scarlet fever that had nearly killed her, about the heartbreaking decision their father had made to let her be adopted by Mary and Frank Morrison in Chicago. Our father never got over it, Robert said. He died believing he had failed Eleanor by giving her away. He never knew that Mary and Frank gave her a loving home, that she grew up to be a wonderful woman. Robert also told me about the family Eleanor had never known, about their mother, who had lived to be 93 and had never stopped talking about her lost daughter, about their brothers James and Samuel, who had both served in World War II and had come home to build families of their own, about their sister Dorothy, who had become a teacher and had touched the lives of hundreds of students over her career. "We have a big family, Sarah," Robert said. "Eleanor has dozens of nieces and nephews and great-nieces and great-nephews. They're all going to want to know about their Aunt Eleanor." I found myself crying as Robert spoke about the family Eleanor had never known. All those years, she had carried the burden of her secrets alone, never knowing that there were people in Nebraska who loved her and had never stopped looking for her. "Robert, I have something to tell you that might be difficult to hear," I said. "Before Eleanor died, she asked me to burn all the documents in the trunk. She specifically told me not to read them, just to burn them. She was still trying to keep her secrets buried, even after death." Robert was quiet for a moment. "She was still afraid," he said finally. "After all those years, she was still afraid. But Sarah, I'm so grateful that you didn't listen to her. If you had burned those documents, I would have died never knowing what happened to my sister. I keep wondering if I did the right thing," I admitted. "I promised her I would burn everything, but then I found Margaret's letter hidden in the lining of the trunk. It felt like fate wanted me to find it." "You did the right thing," Robert said firmly. "Eleanor was protecting herself the only way she knew how, but she's gone now. The living deserve to know the truth. Margaret died, hoping Eleanor would respond to her letter. Our mother died wondering what happened to her daughter. You've given us the closure we've been seeking for 60 years. I realized that Robert was right. Eleanor's request to burn the documents had been about protecting her own fear and shame, not about what was best for the family she had left behind. By reading Margaret's letter and reaching out to Robert, I had honored the deeper truth of what Eleanor would have wanted: connection and love between family members. "There's something else," I said. "I'd like to invite you to Portland for a memorial service. I know it's been a week since Eleanor's funeral, but I think it would be meaningful to have a celebration of her life where you and any other family members could attend. You could meet my mother and father, and we could share stories about Eleanor's life." Robert's voice broke slightly. "I would love that, Sarah. I'm 89 years old, and I don't travel much anymore, but I would move heaven and earth to be there. I have a grandson, Michael, who could drive me out to Portland. He's been helping me with my family history research. That would be wonderful. I'll talk to my mother about planning a memorial gathering. Maybe we could have it at Eleanor's house, where she was happiest." Over the next week, I worked with my mother to plan a memorial gathering for Eleanor. I had told her about finding the trunk and learning about Eleanor's secret past, and she had been stunned by the revelations. "All these years, I thought I knew my mother," she said, shaking her head. "But she was carrying so much pain and fear that she never shared with any of us. She was protecting us," I said, "and she was protecting herself. She had built such a beautiful life as Eleanor Mitchell that she didn't want to risk losing it by revealing the truth about Eleanor Morrison." "I understand why she did it," Mom said, "but I wish she had trusted us enough to share her story. I wish she had known that we would have loved her just as much, maybe even more, knowing what she had survived." Robert Morrison arrived in Portland on a Thursday afternoon, accompanied by his grandson Michael and his great-grandson David. 3 generations of the Morrison family coming to meet 3 generations of the Mitchell family. I picked them up at the airport, and I knew Robert immediately. He had Eleanor's green eyes and the same gentle smile. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and hands that shook slightly with age, but his mind was sharp and his spirit was strong. "Sarah," he said, embracing me at the baggage claim, "I can't tell you how much this means to me. I've been dreaming about this day for 60 years. We drove to Eleanor's house in the Hawthorne district, where my mother, father, and brother were waiting. The meeting between the Morrison and Mitchell families was emotional and beautiful. Robert sat in Eleanor's favorite chair in the living room, holding photographs of her life in Portland, tears streaming down his face. "She looks just like our mother," he said, studying a photograph of Eleanor at age 60. "Same eyes, same smile. I can see the little girl who went away when she was 3 years old." My mother showed Robert through Eleanor's house, pointing out the rooms where she had spent her childhood summers, the kitchen where Eleanor had taught her to cook, the garden where Eleanor had grown her famous roses. "She was happy here," Robert said, standing in the kitchen and looking out at the garden. "You can feel it in this house. She was loved, and she loved back." We spent the afternoon sharing stories. Robert told us about Eleanor's early childhood in Nebraska, about the little girl who had loved to sing and dance, who had been fascinated by butterflies and had tried to catch them in mason jars. "She was always trying to save things," Robert said. "Birds with broken wings, stray cats, even flowers that were wilting." Our mother used to say that Eleanor had the biggest heart of any child she'd ever known. My mother shared stories about Eleanor's life in Portland, about how she had volunteered at the local hospital for 20 years, about how she had never missed a school play or soccer game when my brother and I were growing up. "She was the same way as an adult," Mom said, "always trying to help people, always looking out for others. She made friends wherever she went." In the evening, we held a memorial service in Eleanor's garden. Robert had brought a small stone from the family farm in Nebraska, and we placed it next to the rose bush that had been Eleanor's favorite. "Eleanor Morrison Mitchell," Robert said, reading from a piece of paper he had prepared. "Sister, wife, mother, grandmother, friend. She left Nebraska as a frightened little girl and came back to us as a woman who had lived a life full of love and purpose. She may have changed her name, but she never changed her heart." We stood together in the garden as the sun set over Portland, the Morrison family and the Mitchell family united at last. I thought about Eleanor's final request to burn all her documents, to keep her secrets buried forever. But standing there with Robert and my family, I knew that some secrets are meant to be shared, that some stories are too important to be lost to history. The next morning, before Robert and his family left for Nebraska, I made a decision. I went to Eleanor's basement and gathered all the documents from the trunk. Instead of burning them as she had requested, I gave them to Robert. "These belong to the Morrison family," I said. "They're part of Eleanor's story, but they're also part of yours. I think Margaret would want you to have them." Robert accepted the documents with tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll make sure they're preserved for future generations." Eleanor's story, both parts of it, deserves to be remembered. As I watched Robert's car disappear down the street, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced since Eleanor's death. She had asked me to burn her secrets, but instead, I had used them to build a bridge between two families who had been separated for 60 years. I never did burn the contents of that trunk. Instead, I helped preserve Eleanor's complete story, the painful parts and the beautiful parts, the fear and the courage, the secrets and the revelations. Because sometimes, the greatest gift we can give to the people we love is not to bury their past, but to help them find their way home. 6 months later, I received a package from Robert Morrison. Inside was a beautifully bound photo album titled Eleanor Morrison Mitchell, A Life Remembered. It contained photographs from both sides of Eleanor's life, the little girl in Nebraska and the woman in Portland, the family she had been born into, and the family she had chosen to build. On the first page, Robert had written a dedication to Eleanor, who taught us that home is not a place you can never leave, but a feeling you carry with you wherever you go, and to Sarah, who brought our sister home to us at last. I keep that album on my coffee table now, in the apartment I inherited from Eleanor. Sometimes, when I'm feeling lost or uncertain about my own life, I flip through its pages and remember the courage it took for Eleanor to start over, to build a new life from nothing but hope and determination. Eleanor's story taught me that we all carry secrets, that we all have parts of ourselves we're afraid to share with the world. But it also taught me that love has the power to heal old wounds, that family connections can bridge any distance, and that sometimes the most important promises we make are not the ones we keep, but the ones we break for the sake of something greater. The trunk still sits in Eleanor's basement, empty now except for a single item, a photograph of the Morrison family Christmas gathering in 1959. I left it there as a reminder that some stories are too important to be buried, that some secrets are meant to be shared, and that love always finds a way to bring us home.